do we believe in a restoration of the principles of our founding fathers and others?
Pepperdine and the School of Public Policy is one of only about 5 of 200 graduate policy programs based at Christian University. And because of that, one of the things that we take seriously here is the intersection of faith and politics. How do they integrate in the forming of public leaders and public policy? And that's why I'm so excited to welcome Tim here this evening, someone who's done such an incredible job and set such a great example in integrating his own faith in his political and policy leadership. Before I welcome Tim up, I wanted to start with one of our important texts. As I hope our first year students know, one of the historical points that makes the policy school so unique is that we were founded by the late great political scientist James Q. Wilson. And it was Wilson who helped to design our curriculum, which uniquely balances the liberal arts, philosophy, political history, and so on, with the quantitative, analytical social sciences. And he did that just within a couple of years of writing what many consider his magnum opus, a book called The Moral Sense, which in many ways was a little bit of a surprise coming from Wilson, in the sense that he was seen as a rather rational and hardened social scientist, that which you could not measure did not matter. But in the moral sense, he really does outline the things that fall in between the quantitative and the analytical equations that so often go into the policy decisions that we make. And he begins in a preface with a discussion of those things that are very hard to quantify. And I'm hoping in some ways really does tee up what's so important about Tim's message here today. These are the first 2 paragraphs of his preface. Virtue has acquired a bad name. To young people, it is the opposite of having fun. To older ones, it is a symbol of lost virtue that politicians now exploit for partisan purposes. And to young and old alike, it is a set of rules that well-meaning but intolerant people impose on other people. Yet the reality of daily discourse of ordinary people is filled with oblique references to morality. We talk constantly about being or not being decent, nice, or dependable, about having or not having a good character, about friendship, loyalty, and the moderation or fickleness, insincerity, and addiction. When we overhear these conversations or read about these topics in magazines and novels, we sometimes say that people are preoccupied with personal relationships, the problems of mother and child, of wife and husband, of lovers, friends, and co-workers. The preoccupation is not simply about relationships, however much of it, about what those relationships ought to be. This preoccupation, like the adjectives with which we express it, loyal, kind, or nice, disloyal, selfish, or rude, is with the language of morality, even though we often disguise it in the language of personality. It is the language of virtue and vice. It is the language that this book is about. That's why we exist as a policy school. That's why we care about not only the quantitative analytical part of public policy, which is necessary to making right policy decisions, but also the moral part. Those parts of the social sciences that help inculcate and at least make us aware of our own moral sense. Because public policy is not a science. It is a humane science. It is about leadership and about the decisions we make in accordance with a particular cultural context in which we're working. And so again, that's why I'm so excited to welcome Tim here this evening, someone who has not only written a very important book about these issues, but has written it out of his own experience of decades worth of leadership and combining and exploring his own faith as it relates to politics and policy. And so without any further ado, please join me in welcoming tonight's speaker, Tim Goeglein.
With an introduction like that, I'm tempted to say thank you and good night, but I won't. Dean Peterson, yeah, I'm really honored to be here on the Calabasas campus. I have been a great fan of Pepperdine for many, many years, and it is really just a great honor and blessing to be here tonight. It is particularly an honor to be introduced in the shadow of the late, great Jim Wilson, whom I knew. And The Moral Sense is one of the iconic books. And to, as I say, to be introduced in light of The Moral Sense and in light of his distillation of virtue as the other side of freedom, you honor me very, very deeply. I must say as well that whenever I go to the original House of Representatives, which is typically once a week on Thursdays, I walk right past one of the most beautiful statues in a statue memorial monumentally, festooned city in Washington, Pavasera. And I think it is fair to say, with my right hand in the air, and this is a big statement, that it would be impossible to understand the history, impossible to understand the history of this great state apart from faith. They can't be decoupled, because to decouple faith and public policy, to decouple faith and the history of California would be not to tell the truth. And it's important to tell the truth. And beginning tonight, if I may. Now, as one of the vice presidents at Focus on the Family, I traveled a lot, about 1/3 of my time. And in the academic year, I'm on a different college campus about every 2 weeks. And beginning 11 years ago, when I came to Focus on the Family, I had worked the previous 8 years as a special assistant to George W. Bush at the White House, and for the 10 years before that, for U.S. Senator Dan Coates of Indiana, who later became our ambassador to Germany and the director of national intelligence. And when I would go out from Michigan to Texas, California to New York, and all the places in between, and give a set of remarks similar to tonight, I suppose, there was something that was completely predictable that would happen after every single set of remarks. And I never delivered the same speech twice. Predictably, somebody, it could be an audience of progressives or conservatives or both of the above or none of the above. But somebody predictably, or more than one somebody's, would raise his or her hand and say the following: I've never been more concerned about my country than I am now. If they have children or grandchildren, they would predictably say, and I'm particularly concerned about the country that I am leaving to my children and grandchildren. And the third part of that iteration was the following: and I don't know what to do. And so after all those years of hearing that refrain, I picked up the telephone and called a very good friend of mine. And I said, I've been reading the last several weeks 4 books that seem to echo what I'm hearing in the audiences as I travel for Focus on the Family. I was reading Coming Apart by Charles Murray, a great friend of Jim Wilson's. Generation Unbound by Bell Sawhill. Alienated America by Tim Carney. I hope Tim will at some point come and speak in this series. And February, terrific. And Hillbilly Elegy by my friend J.D. Vance. Now, these are very different books written by very different people. And I want to go backwards. Charles Murray, one of the great sociologists, public intellectuals of our time, a libertarian. The pedigree is the American Enterprise Institute. Bell Sawhill comes from the Clinton White House, now at the Brookings Institute in Washington. and a progressive who cares very deeply about many of the things that we all care about. I mentioned Tim Carney, a fellow conservative with a pedigree of the late great columnist Robert Novak, now at the Washington Examiner, and J.D. Vance. What a remarkable story his is. And every single one of these books, I suppose along with the book Our Kids by Bob Putman of Harvard, delineates a corrosive time in our culture with a particular emphasis on how this corrosion and almost tangible sense of decline impacts those children, grandchildren, and the rising generation that I kept hearing about. And the one great thing about these books is that they are written to distill and to analyze, and in this dysfunction and chaos that they talk about, this cultural disintegration that they outline, they are not meant to be resolution or remedy books. And like Jim Wilson, it's important that we have public intellectuals who say, this is as I see it, driven in large measure by irrefutable data. I wanted to do something different. I wanted to learn and absorb like a sponge from these great public intellectuals, but I wanted to write a book, I said to my co-author, Craig Ostin, that was not so much a delineation of the problem or an empirical data search. What I wanted to do was I wanted to put together a book that talked about the idea of restoration, the idea of regeneration, the idea of renewal in a great country, culture, and civilization like ours. And I dug into, and I think I read everything written by two other great social scientists, a former White House colleague, now at Brookings, Ron Haskins, and the Heritage Foundation's Robert Regnery. I was also saying to Dean Peterson when we were greeting each other a few moments ago, that I was struck by a moment in my own life just a few years ago. I had been invited to a very large symposium at Harvard University in Boston. And after this gathering of people in public policy, a woman came forward and she said, I wonder any longer if we can, as one large, complex, continental nation, she said, I wonder if we still have the capacity, with all of those differences, to agree on what the phrase, we the people, means. And I thought to myself, we have arrived at a hinge of American history. One other thought, if I may. In thinking about the book that I wanted to write, the book that would become American Restoration, how family, faith, and personal sacrifice can help heal our nation. One of the things that I wanted to do in that book was to make very clear that it was my very strong conviction, born of faith, ahead of my conservatism, that there was never going to be a conservative top-down equivalent of the New Deal or the Great Society. I felt very strongly that government-directed, incentivized destruction of the first institutions was enough, and that we needed to go in a different direction. And so faith in the halls of power, where I have spent 30 years of my life, this idea of American restoration was going to be rooted in what the great Edmund Burke called the little platoon. Local solutions that would be born in our families, marriages, parenting, churches, synagogues, neighborhoods, community, and civil service. We have to, I believe, as a nation, find a way to move forward together to shape the future. And we have to ask a question, and this is the one that I would pose at Pepperdine tonight. We have to ask, I think, this singular question. What kind of a country do we want 50 years from now? In my view, we have to have a noble willingness to sacrifice for a larger vision and the sake of the greater good. Those are high stakes. It was Victor Hugo famously said, nothing is more powerful than an idea whose time has come. And I believe that the idea of American restoration, these acts of recovery and acts of renewal, rooted in faith, family, and personal sacrifice, I do very strongly believe that they can help heal our nation. And I think we have a very tall task ahead of us. What we do in our book is we list 15 great ideas to restore the family, to restore the Constitution, to restore civility and magnanimity in the public square. May I say, Dean, the chapter that is getting the most attention is the chapter called The Idea of a Gentleman, restoring the idea of a gentleman. This was born of a letter which came to me from a mother who had written an article that I had written for Focus on the Family Citizen magazine. She was the mother of 4 young boys. And she said, Mr. Goeglein, she said, I've come to the conclusion that every boy will be a man, but not every man will become a gentleman. She said, in our coarsened culture, I've never been more concerned than I am now. I also wanted to combine these great ideas with Aristotle's remarkable insight that what the statesman is most anxious to produce, is a certain moral character in his fellow citizens. Namely, he said, a disposition to virtue and the performance of virtuous actions, a la Jim Wilson. So this is not primarily just another political book. In fact, I would say it's not a political book, or for tonight's time together, not a political discussion. I mean, not primarily. We are talking here about something that is far more important, which is culture. Culture leads. You know, I have lived and worked inside the Beltway for 30 years. And I'm very happy to say there are great exceptions to what I'm about to say. But I think by and large, we should stop making politicians the grand marshals of any parades. Mostly, they don't lead. Mostly, they follow. Culture leads. And I'm happy to pick up on that tonight in our time of dialogue and discussion. You know, I want to take a step aside, if I may, for a moment. I want to go back to the second point that you made. I believe that we are living in 2019 America in the midst of a progressive revolution that is just as mighty and just as powerful as the Cultural Revolution as the 1960s and 1970s. In other words, there is this recurring myth that this social upheaval that began in the 1960s somehow petered out or came to its conclusion at some undefinable time in the 1980s or 90s. And I would argue that this is very far from the case. I think that we are living wave upon wave upon wave on the proverbial beach in culture of the ramifications of what was happening, much of it born, may I say, just a few miles from where we are meeting tonight. What we are facing is nothing less than the problems of cultural and national disintegration. We are in the midst, in other words, of a gigantic, enormous debate with great consequences about the next chapter of America's national life. And the discordant notes are many. I would argue tonight that they are nearly impossible to miss if you listen. And I had a motivation with regard to the narrative. And it was from my friend Charles Krauthammer. He said, "You are betraying your whole life if you don't say what you think, and you don't say it honestly and bluntly." There's wisdom in Charles's observation. One other thing I wish to say. I am categorically an irredeemable optimist. I'm actually a hopefulist. Not a confetti to the wind man, by the way. We as a nation can restore and renew, and we have to keep in mind what Burke told us about conservatism, that its essence is to restore in order to preserve. One of the things that Burke wrote, among all the things that he wrote, I think fits in so beautifully at Pepperdine tonight in light of a conversation about the possibility of national renewal. He wrote, "The means by which Providence raises a nation to greatness are the virtues infused into great men." In other words, reform and not revolution. Evil in Law, many years later, I think, was echoing Burke when he said that civilization is difficult to build and easy to tear down. And I'd like to add something into this mix, if I may. Moral relativism. The dictatorship of relativism. Benedict XVI's great observation. This is, in fact, the zeitgeist that we must address as a nation in the 21st century. Dysfunction and social chaos and disorientation is too often the norm in too many homes and places. And I'd like to skate over to an anecdote, if I may, that is rooted here in Southern California. I was invited 6 years ago this month to speak at the Jackie Robinson Center in Pasadena, California. There is a Jewish woman who funds a rather remarkable ministry that ministers to young boys and girls of color in inner city Los Angeles. And I was asked to come speak at the Jackie Robinson Center to a rather enormous room filled with young African American boys and girls. I would say their ages were from 3rd and 4th grade all the way up to high school. And other than this woman from Los Angeles and myself, everyone else was not white. And I finished my remarks, but before I did, I said the following: "And my father is my best friend." And just like you snap your fingers, it was as if I had said one of George Carlin's dirty words. And I came off of that platform, and I said to my host, Leslie, "What did I say?" And he said, "That was a great speech." I said, "Leslie, I appreciate your comments, but in the middle," "Oh yes, in the middle of it." He said, "You said your father is your best friend." I said, "Yes, I did." He said, "Do you realize that the overwhelming majority of those young boys and girls, young men and young women, they don't know their own biological father, and most of them have never lived in the same home as their biological father for even a single day of their lives." And he said to me, and there are millions of young people like that. And this is why I'm going back to Jim Wilson for a moment, because his great friend, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, and by the way, I'm 55 years old, so we're talking about 1965. You know, in the scope and sweep of American history, this is yesterday. In 1965, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who would go on to become one of the most famous U.S. senators of the 20th century, a great ambassador who worked in both Democrat and Republican White Houses. He was known as a very canny sociologist, and he was very good at working with empirical data and looking at things that no one else was seeing. And in 1965, he wrote a very famous distillation on the state of the Black American family. And he found and I know most of you are sitting down, he found in 1965 that 25% of all African Americans were born out of wedlock. And he called it a crisis. Now you fast forward to 2019. Today, 72% of all Black Americans are born out of wedlock. 53% of all Hispanic Americans are born out of wedlock. And 33% of all native-born whites in America are born out of wedlock. If you disaggregate the data, you will find that just over 40% of all Americans are now born out of wedlock. And if you wrap in another astonishing figure, it's even more jaw-dropping, which is that the majority of babies born to American women, ages 30 years of age or under, the majority of those babies are born out of wedlock. You know, in Washington, the political class is wrapped around the axle on the issue of immigration and tax reform and 1,000 other things. But where is a national discussion on the epidemic of fatherlessness and the impact that the epidemic of fatherlessness is having on this cultural moment? It may seem bad manners, but it is born ultimately of a question and a debate in the public square that has the seed of faith. It's okay to say that a person has a certain idea of America. And in 21st century America, we are too often powered by social media's thin connections instead of wide and deep personal bonds that are more granitic and lasting. This is impacting deeply the idea of what we're doing tonight. So, do we believe in a restoration of the principles of our founding fathers and mothers? I believe that where there are unbridgeable chasms, we have to have a conversation that is civil and magnanimous. To echo Lincoln, we must be friends and we must not be enemies. But we must also be willing to echo Pat Moynihan, who was not shy about saying, as a liberal Democrat, that we were living in the 90s, which seems 47 galaxies ago, that we were living in a moment where we were, in his words, defining deviancy down. And just recently, a University of Pennsylvania law professor, Amy Wax, was attacked, verbally attacked, threatened with her job for talking about the centrality and the foundational importance of what she called bourgeoisie virtues. Really? Those were the virtues that helped found America. George Eliot said of culture, if art does not enlarge men's sympathies, it does nothing morally. And I think that's right. By the way, I know the great Ronald Reagan has been mentioned 3 times tonight. He said, all great change, this is Ronald Reagan, all great change, he said, begins at the dinner table. Did he actually mean that? I think he did. What does all this mean? I think what it means is that good lives revolve around healthy relationships. And I think it also means something else, that all of us, Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives, are none of the above or all of the above, depending on the day of week or time of day, that we are all, as Americans, part of a narrative that is bigger and larger and deeper than our own moment. But we are, in fact, suffering, and I do mean suffering, from a crisis of civil discourse. And it has become, as I said a moment ago about Professor Wax, a kind of sense of bad manners in the public square to talk about the importance of being a Christian, the importance of being a Jew, the importance of being a Buddhist or a Muslim, and not hiding or shading your faith as it relates to what happens in the public square. To cultivate transcendence is a good thing in the public square and not a bad thing. And something else. Why have we become allergic about talking about the goodness and the blessing of marriage? Marriage is God's first institution, and with family is the pillar of civilization. I would argue strongly that we will have no restoration without the restoration of family, marriage, and parenting. There is a divine purpose in life and for a nation. That's what I believe. And I believe that there are millions of Americans who believe the same of both political parties. As the darkness descends, it seems to me that the light can shine more brightly. And coming into the public square and bringing these issues, which are not controversial, into the public square, I believe is an act of goodness. One of my favorite writers is Ronald Tolkien, and I love what he wrote. He said, the chief purpose of life, this is Tolkien, the chief purpose of life for any one of us is to increase according to our capacity, our knowledge of God by all the means we have, and to be moved by it to praise and thanks. I think that's right. I want to pivot away for a moment, if I may, to talk about 21st century public policy. You know, I was in a large debate last week, and in this debate, a gentleman stood up after we had finished most of the debate and got to the questions and answers, and he said the following. He said, in the history of the United States, we have never been more divided than we are now. He said, our politics is so poisonous that we have never had a moment like this. And I reminded him that in the American Revolution, 1/3 of Americans were opposed to the revolution. 1/3 of Americans were for the British, or indifferent. And 1/3 for. That makes 2/3 either indifferent or for the British. The nullification crisis. It seems bad manners, I suppose, to sort of forget that little moment of pre-Civil War history where the entire country almost came undone. Then, of course, we got to the Civil War. I was standing last year in a peach orchard where two brothers had essentially shot each other to death, one for the North, one for the South. They were one of 750,000 Americans to die in the Civil War, not to mention a murdered president by 1865. Do you know that 1/10 of our presidents have been assassinated? And that's not even in consideration of the assassination attempts. I mentioned the social upheaval of the 60s and the 70s. Did I mention Watergate or Vietnam? Massive dislocation and disagreements. Our cities were burning down. Students were being shot on campuses. No, we've been divided before. We've had our toxic differences before. The question is not whether America has been divided before. The question is, can we, in this very difficult time of division, find a way to restore and to renew and to regenerate? And I believe that we can. And I believe in my book and in other books, far better than mine, other discussions, other forums, that there are all kinds of ways that we can actually have not just a national discussion about regeneration and renewal, but to actually act. That's the thing. And our own contribution is not just a delineation of what the problems are. We actually offer what we consider to be some solutions that begin at the most local of levels. Two final thoughts, if I may. The focus on the family office in Washington, D.C. is in the Capitol Historic District, right behind the Supreme Court. And I was walking back from lunch last Friday, and I looked over into the yard of one of my great friends. And she's a progressive. She worked for President Obama for nearly 8 years. I'm quite certain that we disagree on almost all of the major things of life. And she had a sign in her yard which I loved, and it was a quote from Margaret Mead. It said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." And I believe that she was right. Where does this sense of renewal and restoration actually begin? I think it's really okay to disagree agreeably on the biggest things there are. And one final thought, if I may. I know that I'm standing in California and not in Washington, D.C. By the way, I'm looking down at my watch. Our time is 9:15. The fact that the sun is still up makes me very happy. One of my favorite authors, of course, is one of the greatest authors in American history and, of course, of the West, Wallace Stegner. He said, "One cannot be pessimistic about the West." He said, "This is the native home of hope." And I think that's right. So at the expense of lecturing or sermonizing or trying to be Solomonic, I will close there and happily answer or duck a few questions. Thank you. Thank you very much. And this does not strike me as a shy bunch, so I'd love for someone to go first.
Absolutely.
And if you agree, that's wonderful. And if you disagree, that's equally wonderful. I'll learn from you on any topic that I mentioned or otherwise.
Thanks. And I think your lecture really profoundly reminded me of the lecture from Professor Ted McAllister. He's a mentor of mine. Unfortunately, he's not be here. He definitely will ask better questions. And so my question is like from the perspective of conservatism. So
Sure.
Historical imperialism is definitely part of the intellectual virtue of conservatism. Because it views social phenomena as a result of history, as a result of human practice, as a result of culture.
Yes.
So, like in this situation, we talk about the ideal family, the classic family structure, and in contrast, the decimation of the family we are facing today.
Right.
I mean, consider family. Family itself is a social phenomenon. It's not only culturally based; it also should support it by certain cultural, economical, or social infrastructures.
Yes, indeed, I agree.
But but like in this solution, we're calling about this kind of restoration of family, so restoration of certain classical virtues.
Right.
We are facing a totally different historical conditions.
Yes.
So if we are looking at this family structure in the 19th century or 18th centuries, and then we look at the social condition today, you can see there is a huge contradictions. There are certain social infrastructures and then political infrastructure supported this kind of classic family views, either severely weakened or even no longer exist. And some of them maybe like just a historical result, just a result of industrialization, urbanization.
Yes, may I say, I'm actually really thrilled that you asked this question. I mentioned a book earlier called Coming Apart by Charles Murray. If I had to pick one book that encapsulates the wonderful point that you made just a moment ago, that's the book. Charles Murray shows from empiricism that if you have 2 years of education beyond formal education beyond high school, just 2 years, if you get married, you are likely to stay married. If you choose to have children, you will probably have them inside of marriage. Your work ethic is fairly stable. And if you have children, your faith connection is pretty firm. But he shows, and this goes to your point, Charles shows that in America today, for anyone who has a high school diploma only, or does not achieve a high school diploma, it is probable that that person, if he or she gets married, will be divorced, if they ever get married to begin with. If they have children, at least one child will be born out of wedlock. Their work ethic will be very up and down. And their faith commitment now, and this book was published several years ago, but not so far ago that that doesn't make it relevant, is virtually nil. So what we used to call anecdotally the salt of the earth has come apart. And the implications, particularly in this sociology for the family, are very difficult on little people. I mean, in America, I'm going back to your central point. In America, if you have 2 years of a college education or beyond, probably you're going to do quite well.
So you think the crucial element here is education?
Education, but the combination with an overlay of faith seems to be determinative in 21st century America. And by the way, this is consistent with much of Jim Wilson's sociology as well.
Like in some way, like I interacted with many Americans.
Yes.
In my 6 years stay there.
Yes.
And I found many of the people who have a strong family ethic, they don't have to be like very high educated.
Yeah.
I mean, some of them they just come from a place with very strong family values, very strong family virtues, and they have a very strong religious belief. It's definitely a good point to maintain this.
It may say it's very interesting in the social research, and this is just a step beyond what you're asking. In the social research, it's very interesting to when you disaggregate the data on the question, for instance, of religious attachment, right? There is a large swath of Americans who say that they are strong people of faith, which, by the way, that's, we take them at their word. When you ask them, how often are you in church? I mean, for the highest percentage of, of those who are attached to a formal faith or religion, right? But who fall in this category below education beyond high school, church attendance is very rare. That's new in America.
Time for one more question.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for being here. My name is Erin,
A pleasure.
and I write on religious freedom, so I'm wondering if we could turn to your chapter on religious freedom.
Thank you.
You talk about the importance of men and women of faith engaging in our culture
Yes.
in all places, media, politics. And then you also say that in so doing, we cannot compromise the core beliefs of our faith if we are to successfully restore America's spiritual foundation and God-given freedoms. So my question is, can you speak to and I'm going to cause you to invoke the name of Trump here.
It's fine.
There are many people who believe that this is precisely what evangelicals are doing, is compromising their core beliefs.
Yes, sure.
In supporting this particular president, and how do you maintain your integrity? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. You are absolutely right that by very large percentages, self-identified white evangelicals overwhelmingly support this president.
Mm-hmm.
George W. Bush, in which I was involved in 2 presidential campaigns, those numbers were about 75, 76%. For Mitt Romney, they were about the same. For John McCain, about the same. For President Trump, a little bit higher, between 78 and 80%. But in the American experience, it's a binary choice. And if you go back to 2016, the choice was between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And in my view, evangelicals had to make a functional decision. Who was going to support personnel and policies that would most approximate their worldview? And I think that the big, and I talk about this and have written about it, that the biggest single issue for many of these voters was a seat on the Supreme Court that had been held by one of the two most highly regarded originalists or conservatives. And it wasn't just anybody, it was Justice Scalia, who also, of course, had then and now a very important reputation as a faithful Catholic. And so with this open seat on the Supreme Court and the kind of wide chasm of choices on social issues between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, American evangelicals chose Donald Trump. But I think a large part of that was not just Justice Scalia and the future and remaking of the Supreme Court and the federal courts. I think it was also Donald Trump's choice of Mike Pence. And Vice President Pence, among all the politicians on the national stage, had been third in leadership in the House of Representatives. He had come to that position and as governor of Indiana as a very prominent man who had been raised an Orthodox Catholic, but had converted and become an evangelical. And I think that that when this became well known among voters in a very divisive election, on the questions of who was likely, on the question of the future of the Supreme Court, the future of the circuit or appellate courts, the future of the district courts, who was most likely to approximate their view of human life post Roe against Wade, in light of the decision on Obergefell and other decisions that were likely to come before the Supreme Court. And of course, in the third debate, that remarkable exchange between Mrs. Clinton and Donald Trump, now President Trump, on the question of human life. I think that combination, that matrix, was uppermost in the minds of evangelicals who voted.
So that's what got him in there. And so now we've had several years.
Yes.
And I think my question is more to how he's acted and the policies he's been pursuing since he got in. I'm happy to take that offline, Pete, if you're on a time crunch.
No,
I do want to squeeze in one more question.
That's fine. I can answer this in less than 30 seconds.
Yes.
I believe that evangelicals, I'm speaking generally, I'm speaking very generally, I think that they feel vindicated that they now have Justice Gorsuch, who took Justice Scalia's place, Justice Kavanaugh, who took Justice Kennedy's place. And as of 2 weeks ago, 150 nominated and confirmed federal judges. That is the largest number of federal judges nominated and confirmed by any president in the modern era. So the largest domestic legacy of President Trump heretofore, with no peer, is the reformation of the American judiciary.
I want to get in Beatrice here with
Yes,
the last question.
Yes, I'm not going to ask a question, but I have a comment. Just recently, we have a new book published by Andrew Pollack, and it's called Why Meadow Died. His daughter was killed in Parkland High School in
Yes.
Parkland, in Florida.
Yes, indeed.
And why were those children killed? One of the reasons is that the previous administration allowed the school system to accept students into their classes that would have felonies. They were allowed to have 4 felonies per semester for a year and never be brought to the justice system. Now, had this young man been brought to the justice system, he was a troubled young man. And the thing that broke the camel's back, his mother passed away, so he went around killing everyone. Now, first of all, we need to be local and understand our laws for our schools and relate to the federal. But we can't rely on the federal government, we have to do it locally. But the other thing that I'd like to emphasize is that these young students that are in the future to have a better understanding of young people with mental health problems. I worked in that field for a long time, and there is no understanding. If they go into a mental health facility, get help, they go back to a bad home situation, and it's like a round robin. So I don't know if you can do anything about that, but it's very, very important for the mental health part of it.
You know, the breakdown of the family is very expensive. Because when you have the kind of destruction in families, marriages, and parenting, which very often result in major mental health issues, you find all kinds of avenues for things in public life that are very distressing. You know, I want to come back to your point, if I may, and also one that was made earlier about the immigrant experience. I think this is very, very key. For all of the challenges that we have had historically, you know, at every socioeconomic level, and of course I'm speaking at 50,000 feet for purposes of our conversation tonight. Families, communities, parishes, neighborhoods. They have always been the kind of organic shock absorber that has been, by and large, a good thing for young Americans. But we now have too often, aided and abetted by social media, the temptation to a kind of bunker mentality. Left and right, by the way. Left and right. And we talk about this at length in our book. Civility and the need to restore civility and magnanimity in the public square is not in any way decoupled from the fate and state of marriage and healthy community. Thank you for the questions, and thank you for all the questions.
Please join me in thanking our speakers. So that wraps up this evening. I want to thank Tim Goeglein for not only a great book, but an important conversation. I would just say, if you have not read Coming Apart, I know it's probably within at least one of the courses that we offer at the policy school, or Our Kids, the Robert Putnam book. There is a chapter in the Moral Sense just about the family.
Yes, indeed.
And that element, especially as it relates to your point, these mental health issues may not be triggered by the family, but without the bounds of a healthy family, they can be exacerbated. And I think we saw that certainly in the Parkland shooter, and we've seen that in a number of other places as well. These foundational issues are ones obviously we discuss at the policy school. But it's important to understand the challenges that we face as a country, and not be afraid to talk about them, because I think that's in part how we've gotten ourselves into this position. And it's unfortunate that it seems that the only way we can talk about them is in ways that are not civil. And that's why it's important that we're based at a Christian university. Right? We're to speak the truth in love. And I think we have people that are very happy with being truth tellers, but not so happy with the love part.
Dean, may I say something in that regard?
Yeah.
St. Augustine taught us that despair and discouragement is a sin because it negates the hope of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
I believe that.
I do too.
And you know, I think it's important that we say that in light of the fact that Focus on the Family, every Monday morning, I'm part of a meeting with 10 other vice presidents. And we get a report every Monday of what's coming into our help center at Focus on the Family. The number one issue, and we are flooded, is loneliness and a sense of people being feeling that they are all alone and have no connection in their communities.
Well, we are exploring that issue of loneliness at the policy school. And again, it speaks to these broader cultural issues that in some ways are hard to measure until you get to the societal outcomes. Because social scientists are unfortunately getting very good at measuring loneliness. And we're seeing a number of surveys around that. So I'm going to end on that upbeat note. And welcome you to have some refreshments with us. Our speaker's going to be with us for a little while before we head off to dinner. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you.